Greetings to the Commander-in-Chief, to the Central Command Team, the Central Students Command Team, ground forces from the African continent and the diaspora, ground forces. My name is Mpho Morolane, the member of the Central Command Team and head of employment and labor. I'm honored that I will be leading a discussion on Rosa Luxemburg. It's a classical pamphlet that was published in 1889, and it's quite relevant, comrades. We're well aware that the pamphlet, when it was published in a European context. However, questions that were posed then, the questions of economic class, the system of exploitation, it's questions that are asked today in the South African context and the African context and globally. That's why the EFF decided to choose this classical pamphlet of Rosa Luxemburg. And perhaps before we enter into the book, we must explain as to who is Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg was a revolutionary who was born on the 5th of March in 1871. She was an activist who participated in the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and that's when she engaged with the likes of Vladimir Lenin. By the way, she had a paradoxical relationship with Vladimir Lenin because many a times they used to agree and many a times they used to disagree. Even she critiqued and on the Bolshevik movement that they must be aware of the democratic centralism as a method of governing the party, because she was saying the power cannot be centralized in the central committee of the Bolsheviks movement. However, they agreed in many instances. Now, comrades, Rosa Luxemburg started mobilizing the workers drastically when he joined the SPD party in Germany. She presented a dissertation titled The Industrial Revolution of Poland at the University of Zurich. Rosa Luxemburg was not just a desktop revolutionary. She was a mobilizer, an organizer, an agitator. That's why she spent most of the time in prison. She did not spend the time in prison because she was a criminal. She spent most of the time in prison because the system was not comfortable with how Rosa Luxemburg approaches her issues politically. Many classified her as the adventurist. Those who disliked her classified her as a rebel rouser. Not that she was a rebel rouser, but because she was led by her revolutionary conviction. She was seen in all key sides of the struggle. That's why even when she was killed in front of the masses of her people while she was leading them in a demonstration. Comrades, she arrived in Germany in 1898, and that was the time whereby the working class of Germany then, their conditions of working were being improved. And characters such as Edward Weinstein, they started emerging, writing the reformist approach of the politics. In fact, they were mobilizing the working class to adopt the reformist politics. And it was quite key because Rosa, young as she was able to differ vehemently with the likes of Edward Weinstein. Now, comrades, we are going to engage today on the material reform or revolution. And it is very much important that before we enter into the book, we also explain what the terminologies mean, because I know very well that most of you who are watching here, in your everyday vocabulary, you use the word revolution. And in simple terms, what revolution means, it means a complete overhaul, a complete change of the system in which we're existing in. meaning that in the context of South Africa, for an example, and also the continent, we've never experienced the revolution because we ensure that when we took power, there was never a fundamental change in the political landscape and the economic landscape. In essence, what reform means? Reform means a change or improvement of the working class within the current system in which we are existing. Now, when we speak of reformism, we cannot confuse it with a revolution. And let me give you a practical example, because currently we have a global pandemic called COVID-19. In institutions of higher learning, for an example, the institutions decided that students must be given laptops, one student, one laptop. And many students activists might think that acquiring a laptop is revolutionary, whereas that cannot be revolutionary because we're still going to use that laptop in the context of the colonial education in which we're experiencing today. Remember, the EFF is advocating for a decolonial education. Therefore, getting a laptop currently, it can't be revolutionary, but it can only be progressive. In the beginning of the book, Rosa Luxemburg asked two very critical questions, and it's important that we understand these two questions. The first one, she says, can social democracy be against reforms? I repeat, can social democracy be against reforms? That is the first question. The first question is, can we counterpose social revolution, the transformation of the existing order, our final goal, to social reforms? And her answer was certainly no. She went further in saying the daily struggle for reforms is a means and the social revolution is the end or the goal, meaning that reforms should be used as a means to an end to acquire the revolution. We cannot be in a permanent state of reform, according to Rosa Luxemburg. A classical example is that the EFF were partaking in parliament system. The parliament system in its nature, it's a reformist system. What Rosa Luxemburg is teaching us is that we must use reform institution towards the revolution. We are using as the EFF, the parliament system, so that we can go to the coming revolution. Comrades, the classical pamphlets, it has 10 themes or 10 chapters, and I'm going to engage on critical issues on all of those chapters. The first one being the opportunist methods. It is important to know that there are theoreticians, for an example, politicians, activists who call themselves leftists, of which they are not. And to identify them, it is always important to find the core of what it is being said by them, bring it out, dissect it, and see what is the logical conclusion of their arguments. And these people are very dangerous in a way because these are intellectual tricksters. And we have them in our continent, people who claim that they are communists, for an example, but at night they do things that are completely different to what socialism is doing or communism is doing. Now, Rosa Luxemburg was able to identify such characters and rebut their strategies with practice. One of those reformists or revisionists of note is Edward Weinstein. And remember, when Rosa Luxemburg was publishing this article or a pamphlet, it was in response of Edward Weinstein's writing. Now, according to Weinstein, a general decline of capitalism seems impossible because of the way in which capital is able to adapt itself. But we will discuss at a later point how Weinstein is saying capitalism is able to adapt itself. Weinstein, he further says that capitalist production becomes more and more varied, and which is true. It is furthermore proved, argues Weinstein, by the improvement of the economic and political situation of the proletariat as a result of its trade union activities. Now, from this theoretical stand, says Rosa, it is derived the following general conclusion that trade unions must not direct its daily activity towards the conquest of political power, but towards the betterment of the conditions of the working class within the existing system, meaning that we must be reductionist. We mustn't fight for the dismantlement of the system, but we must fight towards its reduction. And let me use this analogy so that we can all understand. You have a slave master and a slave. The slave master will say, I give you 10 whippings. And the slave will negotiate that, master, do not give me 10 whippings. Give me 5 or 3 whippings. And trade unions are like that because you celebrate 3 whippings or 5 whippings as opposed to 10 whippings. Comrades, Rosa Luxemburg reminds us that there are scientific bases of socialism which rest on 3 principal results of the capitalist development. Number 1 being on the growing anarchy of the capitalist economy, such as the inhumane maximization of profit when the working class is being exploited. The second one, she says, is on the progressive socialization of the process of production, which create the germs of the future social order. Remember, we're advocating that the state must be under the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning that production must be in full control of the working class. The third issue that Comrade Rosa Luxemburg is reminding us is on the increased organization and consciousness of the proletarian class, which constitute the active factor of the coming revolution. I mean, the EFF's book club, it's an act of love within its constituency and the South Africans and Africans at large, because if people do not love you, there's no way that they will give you revolutionary material which will prepare yourself for the coming revolution. Part of this EFF book club is so that the ground forces comrades, not only in our country but continentally, are able to be conscientized. Because gone are the days where all political liberation movement are correctly able to engage on the material that is able to emancipate its people economically. Now, from the 3 principal issues, Einstein pulls away from the first of the 3 support of the scientific socialism. He says, Einstein, that the development does not lead to the general economic collapse. Not only does he reject certain parts of the collapse, he rejects that capitalism in its entirety is never going to collapse. Comrades, I'm moving to the second part or the second chapter, and that is the adaptation of capital. Remember earlier on, we spoke about Einstein referring to ways of adaptation of capital. Now, in the second chapter, it is still adaptation of capital. In fact, this is the lifeblood of capitalism. According to Einstein, he says, the credit, the perfected means of communication, and the employer's organization are means in which capitalism is going to adapt itself. Comrades, what we've seen capitalism doing global is that capitalism through credit has entrenched itself as a global parasite, sucking the blood of countries and individuals. A practical example, because we are now in COVID-19, the global pandemic, is that we've seen many countries saying that they are going to the IMF or the World Bank to borrow money so that they can uplift the economy within their countries. But we know very well that going to IMF or the World Bank, it means you are saying they must control your policy direction. Africa cannot exist within structures such as the IMF and the World Bank because we are indebted in their policies, were unable to develop ourselves as a continent economically and otherwise because they give us the direction. The second issue, comrades, that I want you to think about when you must interrogate why this system is extremely brutal. The founders of the Barclay Bank of British, for an example, their primary trade was slavery. Can you imagine in the banking system what ethos are embedded? Because the founders of Barclays Bank that came to our continent and our country invested in ABSA, their primary trade was slavery. There's no way that the banking system, its framework, is for the advancement of the African people general. Also, we've seen historically that families such as the Rothschild established themselves in the banking sector where they were able to borrow money to the monarchs, and in turn, they are able to control the monarchs. When you control the monarchs, it means that you control the people within that particular monarch. Now, people of different countries, comrades, do not support that the credit system as is must continue to exist. Therefore, it can be that this method of adaptation of capital, it will exist in perpetuity because it is not in the best interest of the people of the world. The second issue that I would like to touch on is what Weinstein calls the perfected means of communication. And this is very, very important, comrades. And the first issue that I would like to make you aware of when we speak about the perfected method of communication. For an example, in institutions of higher learning, before your academics can publish papers, they are relying on what is called journals which are highly untransformed. It means that you want to publish in a journal that is extremely regulated. It is regulated by the system itself because the system is pushing the particular narrative. The particular narrative also comes from institutions of higher learning. So it is not true that there is such a thing that is called academic freedom when you still have journals that are highly regulated by the methods of capitalism and they are still controlled by the white people. The other issue is the alternative methods of communication that we normally use. For an example, sometimes there are methods that we think they are revolutionary, only to find out that those methods are not revolutionary because we can't use them to fight a socialist discourse using those methods because they are easily intercepted. Capital can wake up one morning and say, we're canceling this particular method of communication. And I'm referring to the platforms that we use on a daily basis. It can be that the perfected means of communication is going to lead to the adaptation of capital in perpetuity because I just exposed the limitations of the perfected means of communication. The last issue is the new employers organization. These are cartels. I mean, this one, it doesn't need a thorough explanation simply because employers organizations are institutions of capital. I mean, those of you who are in trade union movements, you will know that oftentimes, if the employer doesn't want to engage with you, they call an employers organization that will push the mandate of capital. Now, Rosa, in short, comrades, is saying, now referring to credit, that credit produces all fundamental or antagonisms of the capitalist world. It accentuates them, it precipitates their development, and thus pushes the capitalist world forward to its own destruction. On the employers' organization, according to Bernstein, such organization will put an end to the anarchy of production and do away with the cries through their regulation in production. I mean, that cannot be true, that employers' organizations which are working closely with capital, they are going to lead to the end of anarchy of production. It cannot happen. The anarchy of production will be ended by a situation where the state is under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Comrades, we move to the third part. And this one is the realization of socialism through reforms. Remember earlier on I gave an example that the parliamentary system, for an example, is an institution of reform. And also trade unions. I mean, some of us who are involved in the trade unions work, and we know very well the limitations of trade unions. Trade unions in their nature, they are reformist institutions. According to Weinstein, he says, the trade union struggle for hours and wages and the political struggle for reforms will lead to a progressively more extensive control over the conditions of production. At Weinstein, he says, trade unions, social reforms, and the political democratization of the state are the means of the progressive realization of socialism. But the fact is that the principal function of trade union consists in providing workers with the means of realizing the capitalist law of wages. That is to say, the sale of their labor power at the current market prices. Now, Rosa comes and says, trade unions cannot suppress the law of wages under the most favorable circumstances. The best they can do is to impose the capitalist exploitation, the normal limit of the movement. They have not, however, the power to suppress exploitation itself, not even gradual. And that is correct, because in the context of South Africa and also global, we've seen that the capital has been able to infiltrate trade unions. The reason why you never see progressive unions globally, it's because, for an example, in this country, the leaders of this federation, some of their wives are involved, are in cahoots with capital. Some of them, the reason why they want to form part of the NETLEC is because at NETLEC, which is the National Economic Development and Labor Council, that's where they are able to cut deals directly with capital. That's why unions, they are toothless in the context of South Africa, the continent, and globally, because they are sleeping in the same bed with capital. Schmidt, who was a close ally of Edward Weinstein, says the present trade union movement is in a feeble stage, meaning that it's in its weakest stage. And remember, here we're speaking about 129, 130 years. The conditions then of trade unions are still the same conditions today. Why? Because capital has been able to penetrate the trade union movements. But by the regulation of production, we can only understand two things: intervention in the technical domain of the process of production and the fixing of the scale of production. And the reliance on these two things is that trade unions will play a critical role. Rosa says, what is the nature of the influence exercised by trade unions in these two departments? It is clear that the technique of production, the interest of the capitalist agrees on that. Up to a certain point, with the progress and the development of the capitalist economy, what does the active participation of trade unions in fixing the scale and the cost of production amounts to? It amounts to a cartel of workers and entrepreneurs of businesses in a common state against the consumers, and especially entrepreneurs. In no way is the effect of this way different from that of the ordinary employers' organization. Rosa says, basically, we no longer have a struggle between labor and capital, but solidarity of capital and labor against the consumers or the workers. And capital has been able, comrades, to infiltrate not only trade unions, the society and political parties, because they want to be in control of how different countries are run. The scope of trade union is limited to its essential, says Rosa, struggle for increase of wages and the reduction of labor time, that is to say, to efforts at regulating the capitalist exploitation. But trade unions in no way influence the process of production itself. And let me give you another practical example to show that unions are structures of capital in their form. When trade unions go for negotiations, others, they say, we're going for double digits. Others will go maybe for that 9% or 8%. Now, remember, when labor and business or employers are meeting at the negotiating table for wages, employers come with a particular percentage. In the event a sellout trade union will say, we want 10%, you find that the employer has said that I'm putting 5% on the negotiating table, kipulamlo, meaning it's an icebreaker, right? And that victory, when it comes, trade unions are saying, in the event they get 10%, they say, we have won 10% for the workers. They do not tell you about the low-hanging fruits of 5%, which they did not work for. And many workers, they are not asking these critical questions because there isn't rigorous engagement from the workers with their trade unions. The reduction of wages is, as pointed out by Marx, one of the principal means of retarding the fall in the rate of profit. Remember, even trade unions and everything will come to that chapter that speaks about capitalism and the state. The state ensures that there's legislation where they are able to control the masses of the world. For an example, there was a cry of exploitation of labor brokers. Federations in this country, together with the business, they met, they engaged, and they came up with what is called Section 198 of the Labor Relations Act. That act, and it has A, B, C. Section 198, I'll touch on it only because it speaks unto the labor brokers. It says that when workers have worked for the employer for a period of 3 months, they are then automatically deemed to be permanent employees of the client. What exploiters, businesses do is that when you go to the CCMA, which is pro-employers, they say workers must prove their exploitation. Remember, the law says you are deemed to be a permanent employee. Now the CCMA and the labor court, they say, no, you must prove that you are being exploited. So it shows that these laws are created to suit capital and capital only. If today the federations that are recognized in this country, tomorrow they can stand and say, we're withdrawing our labor, we're going to the streets. The President of the Republic, you must do away with labor brokers. I'm telling you that labor brokers can be done away with, but it is not going to happen. You know why? Because these are the federation leaders who are doing business with capital. Remember, the whole president of the #1 federation in the Republic doing business with Bidvest, with capital. Do you think that person is going to serve the interests of the workers? No, they are not going to serve the interests of the workers. And at the later point, we will explain how capital is creating their own institutions in ensuring that they are able to regulate, they are able to socially control the society. Trade union action is reduced of necessity of the simple defense of already realized gains that I just spoke about when I was speaking about the low-hanging fruit. Even that is becoming more and more difficult. Such is the general trend in our society. Now, Einstein calls labor legislation a piece of social control. Similarly, Schmidt always uses the term social control when he refers to the labor protection laws. And let me explain to you how they were able, capital, to defeat even those leaders of liberation movement. When they came into power, they analyzed that the next problematic thing after this ANC that we have captured is labor. Remember, if labor withdraws its labor, the rent comes to a standstill. They are saying, no, Mandela, Mbeki, Zuma, and those who negotiated in Codesa, for us to control you even before we arrive at giving you direction at Parliament, we must create our own platform where we are able to engage with you one-on-one. And that is the NETLEC. It is the National Economic Development and Labor Council that I spoke about. And I'm going to give you a practical example. They say, before we can negotiate that, let's agree here. That's why the 20 rand minimum wage, the President of the Republic, Cyril Ramaphosa, signed at NETLEC first. When they sign at NETLEC, it arrives at Parliament, they just rubber stamp what has been agreed upon at NETLEC. Who sits at NETLEC? It's organized labor in a form of federation. It's organized business, they term it, and that is capital. And it's the sellouts federation that are sitting there. At that platform, comrades, labor, organized labor, agreed that workers must earn 20 rand an hour as a minimum wage. They don't even advocate for a living wage, comrades. And you say that you are represented at the level of NETLEC. Currently, as we are speaking, issues of workers because of this COVID-19, they are problematic. We know that federation can't do anything because capital is able to engage with them at the back doors. We have a crisis in this country because once they capture the state, they capture trade unions, then there's what is called a policy capture. Now, all those committees in Parliament, comrades, they are not serving justice to the people of South Africa because they are influenced by capital first at platforms. And there are many different platforms within the state which operates like how the NETLEC is operating. The so-called social reforms are enacted in the interests of capital, and there's no doubt about that. Einstein committed a mistake in believing that the unlimited development of trade union movements will be the emancipation of the masses of the world. And that cannot be true. I mean, today, some of these unions that you are celebrating, they have shares at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Socialist trade union shares at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. There's no way the trade union will want the dismantlement of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Why? Because they have invested in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So all those trade unions that have invested are reformist and are reformist at the highest order. And remember, because some of you are going to say, no, but you as well as the organization, you are participating in the politics of the reformists. What makes us different is that we're saying we're using Parliament as a vehicle or a tool towards the coming revolution. 26 years post the democratic dispensation, you can see that the interest of many of these trade unions, it is to remain in a state, but not to take people towards the revolution. When the capitalist development, comrades, has reached a certain level of interest of the bourgeoisie as a class, and the needs of the economic progress begin to clash, even in the capitalist sense, it shows itself in extremely two important issues. One being militarism, secondly being the policy of tariff barriers on the other end. Without tariff production, the development of large industry would have been impossible in several countries. Rosa Luxemburg says, we must agree that war has been an indispensable feature of the capitalist development. Rosa further says that the US, Germany, Italy, the Balkan states, Poland, all owe the conditions of the capitalist development to wars. I mean, we can see recently that the United States of America wanted war against Iran. And in the event that war started, and that war would have been won by America, we know very well that it was going to be to the benefit of the United States of America, because they want the control of that oil that is in the Iran. The conflict within the capitalists manifests itself even more emphatically in modern parliamentarism. This serves to express within the organization of the state the interests of the whole society. But parliamentarism expresses here is capitalist society, that is to say, a society in which capitalist interests dominate. The democratic forms are sacrificed by the bourgeoisie and by its state representatives. Section 25 the Constitution. There was parliamentary hearings that says that there should be an amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. Now, even Donald Trump threw tantrums in responding to a lame tone of Cyril Ramaphosa when he was trying to copy President Robert Mugabe. He said, no, Trump must keep his USA and I will keep my South Africa, in a very lame tone. Now, they were able to say to them, these ones who are ruling us, that if you change it to the benefit of your people, then you are going to see what we are made of. And because they are afraid of capital, Section 25 is not going to be amended the way we want it to be amended. Comrades, I'm moving to the fourth chapter, which is capitalism and the state. And this is quite critical because it shows us how capital is then able to control these governments. There's a hierarchy, comrades. I'm not showing the prescribed political material in universities. They are able to teach us about this hierarchy. But this hierarchy at the top, you have capitalism. In the middle layer, you have the state. At the bottom, you have institutions of state which are embedded in the trias politica. The trias politica is the separation of powers. That is the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. And here I'm going to use the policy conference, the conference of the ANC, how capital begins at capturing the state. They invest billions of rands and they say, we want Cyril Ramaphosa. They invest, they determine the outcomes of the policy conference of the ANC. Once they win the policy conference, they win they determine the outcomes of the conference. In turn, they means in the event the ANC wins, they are in control of the state. The capturing starts there. They even use our beloved lawyers to some extent to say that reduce delegates of a candidate 1 or candidate 2, because what we want is candidate 1, because he's not problematic, that one. He will be able to toe the line. That is how they are able to capture the state. Even under this global pandemic, you've seen that the first consultation that were made was consultation with business first. And political parties and others, the society, it becomes a formality where the state president saying I'm consulting. But once he agrees with capital, the word of capital will stick as is. The state became capitalist with the political victory of the bourgeoisie. Capitalist development modifies essentially the nature of the state, widening its sphere of action, constantly imposing on it new functions, especially those affecting the economic life, making more and more necessary its intervention and control of the society. Now, the state, comrades, it's extremely dangerous when it's under the capture of capitals, because there's no way that we are going to see the poverty that is engineered being dismantled by our government. That's why, as the EFF, we must warn against the participation in the politics of food parcels. There's no scientific basis on the politics of the food parcels, because we can't reduce the masses of South Africa to food parcels. In fact, when you are an activist, you are giving food parcels, you must be worried, you must be ashamed of yourselves, because we must be discussing ideas as to how are we creating jobs, how are we creating business which are going to be sustainable for the masses of South Africa. Comrades, I'm going to move to chapter 5, and this is the general nature of the reformism. I won't delve deep in this theme because it speaks about the opportunist method, the adaptation of capital, the realization of socialism through reforms. But of note is that Weinstein says trade unionism and parliamentary activity gradually reduce the capitalist exploitation. Here, Weinstein is being a reductionist of note, and we will address it at a later point. Comrades, I'm going to move to the 6th chapter or the 6th theme. And this one is quite critical because it speaks unto the economic development and socialism. Now, South Africa, to get this correct, we must push for aggressive trade within the African continent. We must push for industrialization. And industrialization, it mustn't be the industrialization of the region of the South or South Africa alone. When South Africa industrialize, Lesotho must industrialize, Zimbabwe must industrialize, Zambia must industrialize, so that we are able to trade amongst one another. For an example, in this country, we used to have the textile industry, which was very strong. Because of the post-democratic neoliberal policies that we've adopted, we even export simple things such as the socks. I was very shocked to hear the other day that there isn't a single country that is able to produce condoms in this continent. I mean, South Africa, we're told that it contributes 15% of the HIV and AIDS global statistics, but we're not even able to come up with measures of circumventing the disease. We are relying on the United States of America. We can't even produce a rubber, comrades. That is a worrying fact. We've seen post the democratic dispensation where the ANC came with a reformist approach of the black economic empowerment system. It didn't work because it was a reformist approach. Remember, here you have management which have been in charge of those companies in the apartheid era, and you are expecting post-democracy that they must change their apartheid ways of doing things. It's not going to happen. They are only going to change cosmetically. They are not going to bring the fundamental change. You can have your African CEOs or black CEOs, but in the middle layers of management, the decision makers, we still have situation where it is white people who are taking critical decisions. That's why these institutions are not able to transform. Maybe we must stop using the word transform. We must use dismantle so that we can begin and start institutions afresh in the interest of the African people and all people existing in this continent holistically. It's even said that the government does not even have proactive measures in ensuring that there is compliance of regulations. It's very sad that you have cleaners who are made directors of many of these companies because of compliance. I mean, these mamas, they don't even know that they are made directors of companies which are making millions and millions of rands with impunity, comrades. You still have white-only companies, and I'm repeating, white-only companies that are getting tenders from the states, and nothing is happening about that. And we're not shocked. Why? Because we have the current government that is afraid of business, that is afraid of capital. That's why capital is able to do as it wishes. And maybe let me use this example so that it can sink in. You see, malls are problematic, and I'll go deeper why malls are problematic. In fact, malls are the microcosm of a crisis that we're having in our own society. Every time when capital, to some extent, together with government, are building malls in the society, we celebrate and say that development is coming. That cannot be development because the people of that particular township are only subjected to labor, and they are going to be consumers in that mall. What is very sad is that the mines which are exploiting our people, they take the resources, they go abroad, they come back as finished products. Ourselves, when we get married, or some of you who are married, you go to the malls, you buy the rings. Who profits? It's capital. They've profited in the mines, they profit again in the mall. The farmers that are working at those farms producing potatoes and all of that, they benefit through the exploitation of the workers in the farms. Those potatoes, they come back in our townships, in the malls, and we buy them, meaning Africans are reduced to laborers and consumers only, meaning profit is not meant for them. The systems of malls in its current structure is problematic and is the microcosm of all the crises that we're having in our own society. And our African brothers and sisters, many a times are at the receiving end of this exploitation, because these companies of white people, they hire them at a lower rate, they pay them less. It then creates a discord or a fight between South Africans and our brothers from whether Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and all of that. When there is what is called xenophobic attacks, the victor is not a South African, is not Malawian or Zimbabwean. it is the capital, because when the fight is not directed at capital, the capital becomes the victor, comrades. And I'm going back to the malls to show that we don't even sometimes interrogate these issues deeply. You find that there is a project in a particular township, and the people in a ward where the mall is being built, they even go to an extent of saying, no, that employer is coming with people from a different ward. Now, we now start fighting amongst ourselves to say that the jobs must be reserved for people who are coming in our wards. We disregard people in other wards, forgetting that it's people of Temba or Hammaskral fighting amongst themselves. Who benefits? Capital. Who brought people from other wards? Capital. Who brings people to work in those restaurants and all of that? It's capital. Now, we must learn to direct the war at the correct enemy. The industrial capitalist of today is a collective person composed of hundreds and even thousands of individuals. The category of the capitalist has itself become a social category. It has become socialized. In the course of the latest development in his ideas, Einstein furnishes us in his book a new assortment of proofs, the statistics of shareholding. These statistics are used in order to prove that the number of shareholders increases constantly, and as a result, the capitalist class does not become smaller but grows bigger. I mean, shares are to some extent a scam because we know who it benefits. It doesn't benefit the people at large, but it benefits capital. Comrades, I'm moving to chapter 7, cooperatives, unions and democracy. And I won't touch much on unions. I will touch more on cooperatives and democracy because I think I touched critical aspects of trade unions. Why Rosa Luxemburg is saying they are reformist institutions, and we agree with that. Now, on cooperatives, unions, and democracy, Einstein says socialism offers to the workers the prospect of sharing the wealth of the society. The poor are to become rich. The poor can't become rich in the modus operandi of capitalism. That will not happen. Einstein further says that socialism is to be realized with the aid of two instruments: labor unions, as he characterizes them, economic democracy, and cooperatives. He says labor unions will suppress industrial profit. Cooperatives will do away with the commercial profit. Comrades, some of the activists I've engaged with have said that cooperatives are an alternative to insourcing, whereby workers who were employed by a service provider are now employed directly by the primary employer. Now, that cannot be revolutionary, it's progressive. Remember, you are taking them from a certain layer to a notch higher. Yes, workers can have those cooperatives, but it can't be the solution because once 100 workers who were working for Bidvest as cleaners gets a corporate, and then Bidvest says, no, here's your stake, workers, you've done a good job, we're now giving you a cooperative. In turn, because they will be operating within the rules and regulation of capital, they are going to change because themselves, they'll be driven by profit. So cooperatives are progressive. They can't be revolutionary because they will be embedded in the current economic system. Cooperatives, especially in the field of production, constitutes a hybrid form of the midst of capitalism. Now, Rosa says the domination of capital over the process of production expresses itself in the following ways. Labor is intensified, the working day is lengthened or shortened according to the situation of the market. Consumers and therefore producers, cooperatives are excluded in the most important branches of production: the textile, mining, metallurgical, and the petroleum industries, machine, locomotive, construction, and shipbuilding. I'm now going to touch on the issue of democracy. Einstein says democracy is an inevitable stage in the development of society. To him, democracy is the great fundamental law of the historic development, the realization of which is served by all forces of political life. Rosa responds and says, Einstein's thesis is completely false. It appears as a petty bourgeoisie vulgarization of the results of a very short phase of the bourgeoisie development. She says we reach an entirely different conclusion when we examine historic development of democracy a little closer and consider at the same time the general political history of capitalism. When capitalism began with the first production of commodities, it resorted to democratic constitution in the municipal communes of the Middle Ages. Later, when it developed manufacturing, capitalism found its corresponding political form in the absolute monarchy. Democratic institution, and this is of the greatest significance, I agree with Rosa, have completely exhausted their function as aids in the development of the bourgeoisie society. Here, comrades, Rosa says something which is extremely critical. She says we must conclude rather that the socialist movement is not bound to bourgeoisie democracy, but on the contrary, the fate of democracy is bound with the socialist movement. Democracy does not acquire greater chances of survival to the extent that the socialist movement renounces the struggle for its emancipation. On the contrary, democracy acquires greater chances of survival as the socialist movement becomes sufficiently strong to the struggle against the reactionary consequences of world politics and the bourgeoisie desertion of democracy. And I explained the narrative of Nazareth as to how they are capturing the state. It doesn't start in parliament, it starts way before. That's why also when the apartheid government, they knew that the system was going to collapse. They started engaging the beloved Nelson Mandela in prison way before 1994 because they were preparing him for their own status quo. He who would strengthen democracy must also want to strengthen and not to weaken the socialist movement. He who renounces the struggle for socialism renounces both labor movement and the democracy. Comrades, I'm going to move to the conquest of political power, which is number 8. And Einstein sees the legislative course of historic development as the action of intelligence, while the revolutionary course is for him the action of feeling. Einstein sees reformist activity, he recognized them as a slow method of historic progress, revolution as a rapid method of progress. In legislation, he sees methodical force; in revolution, he sees a spontaneous force. Here, he's insinuating that there isn't an intellectual discourse in a revolution. And history has proven, and a classical example here is the Cuban Revolution, that there was precision when they were approaching the dictator called Batista. And it shows that they were facing, the state here, the full might of the state, but they were able to conquer the person who was in charge of the state. If there was no theory that was leading that revolution, without that the Cuban Revolution could not have succeeded. And we're proud as a 26 July movement that the Cuban doctors are here assisting us. I wonder if the ministers are not embarrassed to have another country that has more or less the similar crisis going to them saying, give me your doctors. Why don't you come up with your own development in ensuring that we have as many doctors as we possibly can? Comrades, the conquest of political power. Weinstein sees the legislative course of historic development as the action for intelligence, while the revolutionary cause is for him the action of feeling. I thought I must repeat that so that we can emphasize it. Rosa says, and this is quite critical, no law obliges the proletariat to submit itself to the yoke of capitalism. Poverty, lack of means of production obliges the proletariat to submit itself to the yoke of capitalism. And no law in the world can give to the proletariat the means of production while it remains in the framework of the bourgeoisie society. For not laws, but economic development have torn the means of production from the producer's production possession. We see on a daily basis what the yoke of capitalism is doing to our societies. It is subjecting young people at the age of 10 to be subjected to child rebels or soldiers. We see that the yoke of capitalism engineers the poverty that we are seeing on a daily basis. We see on a continuous basis that there are transactional relationships which are extremely abusive because of the yoke of capitalism. It is not true that all governments which are operating within the capitalist states, they are going to alleviate poverty, because poverty is engineered by them. To some extent, some of these leaders, they are part of engineering poverty in our societies. And it's very sad. Let me use this notation of Kwame Nkrumah, where he said that seek ye political power first and the rest shall follow. From Cape to Cairo, all these presidents, maybe with an exception of Muammar Gaddafi or 2 or 3, after they were in political power, they relaxed political power, served their families and close friends. The rest did not follow, you see. So it can't be that after the EFF attains power, because it's going to happen, the EFF remains in the comforts of the state. We must use the state in ensuring that the conditions of our people are going to be changed drastically. People subjecting themselves to the yoke of capitalism came through legislation. When mining was discovered, for an example, in this country, Africans people, especially gold, Africans were resisting that we have our own mates who are not born workers. And we understand very well, comrades, we've seen some of the critiques on social media that we are focusing on a Eurocentric text. And that is very subjective, because remember, questions that were asked there in Europe, it's questions that are being asked today in our country and in the continent of Africa. It is very important that we must understand the history of capital. We must understand the conditions in which we find ourselves in, because we are in this society. Some of you are correct when you say that we must engage in the African literature, but we can't operate only narrowly focusing on the African literature, not focusing on the internationalist politics. Weinstein introduces a very problematic theory by warning the proletariat against the danger of acquiring power too early. That is, according to Weinstein, the proletariat ought to leave bourgeoisie society in its present conditions and suffer a frightful defeat, meaning that the status quo is correct for as long as you have trade unions fighting for the working class, reducing exploitation. That will lead to a gradual a transition where people, the working class in particular, find themselves partaking in the economic mainstream. I think Weinstein was a reformist of note, and we must thank Comrade Rosa Luxemburg, who was very, fierce in rebutting many of these issues, both theoretically and practically. Rosa says, most importantly, if our program contains the formula of the historical development of society from capitalism to socialism, it must also formulate in all its characteristic fundamentals all transitional phases of this development, and it should consequently be able to indicate to the proletariat or the working class what ought to be its corresponding action at every moment on the road towards socialism. There can be no time for the proletariat when it will be obliged to abandon its program or be abandoned by it. That's why Anton Pankow says that to a certain extent, capitalism is spiritual. And when you are responding to systems which are spiritual, it means in a way you must be spiritual. And the historical materialism, comrades, of Karl Marx, if you've read that, you would realize that even the system before capitalism, it's recent. I mean, it tells you about the development of us as a human first, before even the isms. And that is quite critical, because if you don't peruse in such material, some of you within our organization will even go to an extent that we won't be able to collapse the capitalist system, meaning that when we fight, we must not also only fight physically, but we must fight spiritually as well, because our enemy is also fighting spiritually. Another chapter we're moving is the collapse, and I'm not going to dwell much on this one. It's basically Rosa's analysis of Weinstein. I mean, she says Weinstein began his revision, of social democracy by abandoning the theory of the capitalist corrupt. When Weinstein abandoned the standpoint of the working class, he lost his political compass. When he abandoned scientific socialism, he lost the intellectual axis. The last one, comrades, is the issue of the opportunism in theory. The opportunist practice is essentially irreconcilable with Marxism, but it also proves that opportunism is incompatible with Marxism, but it also proves that opportunism is incompatible with socialism in general, that its internal tendency is to push the labor movement into the bourgeoisie path, that it tends to paralyze completely the proletarian class struggle. Comrades, in conclusion, what the reformists are saying, they are saying that we must not fight for the dismantlement of the current system in which we're operating, but we must reduce it. Instead of 10 whips, we must at least incur 5 whips. What the reformists, together with capital forces, are saying, the working class must postpone their hunger while they are eating on a daily basis. And remember, these are savage people who don't have a problem in the poor masses of the people, postponing their hunger to next week while they are eating today. We have seen the sellout sunset clauses failing the people of this country and also globally. The question, fighters, is do we reform or do we revolt? Amandla.